All right, well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rhonda Sienkiewicz with the National Trust. I'm coming to you from our headquarters office in Washington, D.C., and we are happy to present the final in our summer series of webinars. Today's topic is leveraging LinkedIn for stronger online networking. And this series we're calling Navigated the Unexpected, Fundraising and Job Searching for Historic Preservationists. And we scheduled this series of webinars to address the unexpected and difficult changes brought on by governmental actions that continue to impact the field. These focus on loss of key funding sources and significant workforce reductions in the field. So today is the last in the planned series of 4. And relevant to this topic, we are also promoting the National Trust's LinkedIn site for job seekers and supporters, and ask you to use this group as a platform to connect while we're still continuing to be a forum for everyone to post events and forum for information. We also want to encourage those who are seeking job to use the group as a tool to build connections and share more of what you're looking for or searching for. So feel free to log into LinkedIn and introduce yourself there as well. Before we get started today, we have a few logistics. First of all, we're taking questions from the audience. We ask that you use the Q&A function that is at the bottom of your screen, so we are better able to find your questions, but also encourage you to communicate with everyone else through the chat. The closed captioning is enabled for this webinar. And then we will also be sending a recording of this webinar to the email address that you used to register for this session. And all of our webinars are available on our YouTube channel. So lastly, this webinar series is brought to you by Preservation Leadership Forum, which is the professional level of membership at the National Trust. And we thank all of you members that are attending the session today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dave Ferguson, who is a talent acquisition specialist here at the National Trust. He's joining us again. He was part of our series earlier this summer and had an Ask Me Anything about job seeking and recruiting. And today, Dave will focus on using LinkedIn for networking and job seeking. So Dave, take it away.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. Really appreciate the introduction and all the great work you've done to make this happen. Shout out to Colleen as well, and Priya and Absentia. As Rhonda said, my name is Dave Ferguson. I am the talent acquisition specialist here at the National Trust, so I oversee all of our recruiting and retention efforts, as well as lead a diversity scholarship for graduate students and a summer internship program, which we just wrapped two and a half weeks ago. We had 25 summer interns, all paid, working on projects across the trust for about 8 weeks. So yeah, so that's kind of what I do here. Grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, lived in Chicago for 15 years. So those are two of my favorite cities. So I was happy to see those pop up in the chat. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started, but if at any point you have questions that are urgent or sort of point of information, feel free to just chime in, and I'm happy to respond, although we've obviously allocated time at the end. Thanks so much, Rhonda. So yeah, just to start off, benefits of LinkedIn, right? Obviously, this is the largest professional online network in the world, right? There's something like over 200 million users in the US alone. I think it's a billion or close to that worldwide. So the vast majority of employers and professionals in the country are on the platform in some form or another, right? So it's just a great place to be and sort of present yourself. In terms of building a professional identity, you really want to ask yourself, who are you professionally, right? Before you kind of get into the details of how to build out page and all of that on a more sort of existential or philosophical level. I think that's a key question to ask. And then from there, what would you like to signal to the broader public in your field or various fields of interest, right? And then, as it relates to creating and strengthening professional relationships while enhancing your network, you should think about LinkedIn in this way. Rather than it being a panacea, LinkedIn is really one tool among many, and I think should be seen and utilized as part and parcel of a broader professional ecosystem, right? With conferences, symposiums, and other in-person events existing in a symbiotic relationship with the platform. For example, I'll often meet someone in person at a conference or some other event. We'll exchange information and then we'll reconnect on LinkedIn, which is simply to say it isn't a replacement for all the other ways you might engage relevant interlocutors through in-person events and interactions, but it's something that is supplementary in many ways. Locating jobs and internships, right? So at the trust, and this is the case for many employers in preservation and beyond, we post all of our full-time jobs on the platform, which allows us to connect with potential applicants, right? And then also occasionally engage in conversation around those positions. And then lastly, on this slide, um, another benefit is this allows you to attract the attention of recruiters, right? A compelling and thoughtful profile page can attract our attention, particularly as we're looking for talented pr prospective candidates, in many cases, passive candidates, right? Which is simply another way of saying those are people that aren't actively looking for jobs. Next slide. Thanks so much. So yeah, kind of, returning to what I said earlier, right? In terms of your profile and what makes you stand out, really think about what you want viewers to take away from your profile. Put another way, how do you want to present yourself to the world professionally, right? While you certainly want to be able to express as broad a set of interests as necessary to present your full self, don't be afraid to edit, right? We're all well-rounded, complex people with disparate interests. However, people are generally spending a mere matter of seconds with your profile and quickly reaching certain conclusions, right? So you just want to be mindful of that as you figure out a way to distill all the many different things you've done, the interests you have, into a package that is manageable and digestible for folks, right? So what I recommend there is, highlight a couple of core professional identities in your tagline, whether or not some of you may have gone and sought out my page. You may have noticed my tagline is recruiter and sociologist. Though these are distinct professional identities, and in some ways, much to my chagrin, I don't actually earn a living as a sociologist. My training as a sociologist guides my approach to how I think about recruiting, retention, and culture here at the National Trust, right? As I try my very best to think in systematic and structural ways about power, race, gender, bias, etc., and how those forces impact our work, right? As we think about equity and other kind of important concerns for folks working in talent. So, just kind of think about the different things you've done and the ways in which what may seem to be distinct or identity categories that don't necessarily align may be able to say certain things to each other, right? That you can kind of get at a sort of intersectional approach, right? And to pivot from there, a summary is often a useful tool, particularly if you've worked across a variety of sectors or fields, as that summary allows you to create a narrative. And again, to the earlier point, bring some cohesion to your profile, right? I recognize that many of you, particularly in light of the drastic changes made by the current administration, because this is being recorded, I won't editorialize. But those changes have had major effects, right, on all of our lives. And many of you have had expansive careers where you've worked in different sectors. You may be looking to pivot into a field where you have less experience. And again, what I suggest is that to the extent you can think creatively about what you've done in the past and find and articulate the through lines in a summary, I think that can be really helpful. Again, for those of you attempting, or pardon me, helpful for those attempting to get a handle on the diversity of your experiences, skill set, and sort of walking away with a more holistic picture of who you are and what you've done. Next slide. Right. So networking on LinkedIn. This is probably obvious to all of you, but start with those that are closest to you and work your way out from there as it relates to how you build out your network. Right. You all have people in your network who can be helpful, right? Who have expertise, have worked in certain areas. And these folks really represent the proverbial low hanging fruit, right? So, what I'm again suggesting is that you ask these folks in your network to broker introductions, right? People who you don't know are, of course, far more likely to respond to you if someone they know and trust has made the introduction and, in fact, vouched for you, right? Nevertheless, even if you've had this introduction, it's been brokered by someone who you trust, who respects you, etc. When you're reaching out to people outside of your network, do your very best to be precise in terms of your introduction as it relates to who you are, what you're interested in, and the ultimate ask, right? Your ability to be concise, thoughtful, specific, and clear about what you want will set you apart from others who are in many cases sending a version of the same email to 50 different people, right? So again, in sort of an environment where there's a lot of competition, market competition, just to sort of speak frankly about it, to the extent that you can be clear, concise, you're really going to stand out. And then, as it relates to sort of the cold call, or what's more common, the cold email or cold message, right? When you're reaching out to folks outside of your network, folks that you don't know, they're more likely to respond to this sort of cold outreach, to connect if you're able to, again, craft a thoughtful message that accompanies your request, rather than just sort of saying, seeing someone and asking them to connect as a sort of LinkedIn contact, right? And just to follow up with that, the AI generated responses that are fairly common are also quite generic and less likely to garner a response, and certainly the response that you're looking for, right? So, again, in a world that is increasingly overrun with artificial intelligence, a carefully crafted message solely written by you as a human being is really going to stand out, because, and I'll speak about this a bit later, but suffice it to say, I get both, and it's very easy for me to tell the difference. And again, I'm far more likely to respond to something that has a clear human touch. Next slide. Thank you very much. So, informational interviewing, right? Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar and have done this sort of thing in the past. but for those that may be new to it, this is a form of networking based around one-on-one conversations where the goal is to develop knowledge of or learn more about a particular field, an employer, or a role that's of interest to you, right? So moving on from there, the more conversations you're able to have in this space in terms of informational interviewing, um, the better, right? Both as a way of expanding your knowledge base while also building your network. Just to kind of draw on personal experience, when I was on the market 4 years ago and looking for a job, and ultimately the job ended up being the one you see me in at the National Trust, I probably had 20 to 30 informational interviews, easy, and was able to do a number of things through that process, right? One of those things was to put people on notice that I was in fact looking for a job, right? Which allowed them to also be looking for jobs on my behalf because through the conversation, they were able to gain a sense of what my skills are or were, the kinds of opportunities that were most interesting to me, and again, they would just kind of have an eye out and have their ear to the ground, to the street, so to speak, if anything came up, right? Another thing that came as a result of that is that I was also getting smart on a variety of fields and roles, right? In some ways, I was pivoting from an executive search background, which was client focused, to looking at roles within organizations, right? Which is a very different kind of recruiting. So to be able to have conversations with people that were recruiting for Netflix or Google or Amazon or Capital One or McKinsey or some other a nonprofit was really valuable experience, right? And allowed me to really get smart, as I mentioned. Um, I think these can be in person or online, on the phone, even. I would lean towards the in person or the online, right? Because in many ways, what you're trying to do, and I'll say more about this, I think, in um, the next bullet, is you're really trying to use these informational interviews as opportunities to prepare yourself for actual interviews, right? Whether it's not informational, it's you interviewing to get an actual job, right? So the more that you can simulate that experience, right, either through in person, which is less common than it was 5 or 10 years ago, or online, which is kind of how the vast majority of interviews take place, at least at the National Trust, where my colleagues and I work. I think is useful. 30 minutes, I think, is an appropriate ask in terms of time, right? Because it suggests you're respecting their time and generosity while also it's providing you the time you need to get what you need to get out of the conversation. And lastly, on this front, while an informational interview is not meant to serve as a direct means to a job, it can, in fact, and should help to get your name out in the world, which is to say, into the field of your choice, while also allowing you to get some reps, right? And of course, reps there just means repetition. And the reps are important for all of us, but especially I think for folks that haven't been on the market for a number of years, right? It can certainly take some time to get comfortable selling yourself to a potential employer. If you've been in a job for 10, 15 years, right, it can be a bit daunting selling yourself to an employer or even a single individual, right? So this can kind of allow you to do some of that in a lower stake environment, right? Where you're both asking questions about the other person's role while also fielding questions about your career interests, skills, passions, etc., But again, to reiterate, it's in a lower stakes environment. And again, to go back to personal experience, in my first few conversations, I was unfocused and a bit all over the place, and they did not go well, right? However, over time and multiple conversations, in my case, over months, it took me a long time, much longer than I'd anticipated to find a job this last go round. But over multiple conversations, I was able to hone in on a more concise narrative about who I was professionally. And then that really bore fruit once I hit the formal job market and was interviewing with real stakes. Next slide. Thank you very much. Yeah, so in terms of recruiters reaching out to source candidates, I mean this varies, but depending on who you talk to, but generally, we're going to be most attracted to candidates again who streamline their profiles, have sort of thought about and included the relevant keywords that will then appear in a Boolean search, right? Which is just kind of what we're going to have to do when there are 200 million users on a site, right? So some of the things that would stand out to me if I'm doing a preservation search is obviously the word preservation, section 106, knowledge of Secretary of Interior standards, easements, etc., right? This, of course, is simply an example of relevant keywords and descriptors for a fairly standard preservation role. And you'd likely find most of those descriptors in one of our job descriptions, right? If I'm doing a development search or marketing or legal, I'm going to be looking for different things, of course. And then as it relates to looking for potential candidates, we're also gonna sort of use certain employers as proxies, right? Where, I mean, had I written this is almost anachronistic, I guess. Had I written this 8, 9 months ago, the National Park Service would still be a major place where we're looking. I mean, now we're looking there, but unfortunately, it's because people are trying to figure out ways to get out of there, just given again the aforementioned changes at the level of the federal government and be precise, the Trump administration. But in any event, the Park Service, SHPO, State Historic Preservation offices, historic house museums, et cetera, right? So again, these are places where I can kind of do a search to figure out how many people will come up. And in historic house museums, obviously, that wouldn't necessarily be the search. I would have a list of 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 different named historic house museums that I would search for, right? Um, and then thank you for that as well, the National Preservation Partners Network. Excellent suggestion and recommendation there as well. But yeah, this is just really not meant to be exhaustive, obviously, but just to suggest our recruiters narrow down, that 200 million plus users to a more manageable pool that's really tailored to our particular needs for any given job, right? And then, the reason why you're networking in some ways is so that you can get into other people's networks, right? There's sort of an aspect of self-interest that is undergirding all of this, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, right? Because what we're often going to do is I'm going to use networks of trusted professionals, people in the field. A lot of those people are my colleagues at the National Trust because I'm not a preservation myself, right? I'm a talent person who works for a preservation organization. So I'm going to look at my colleagues who have expertise in preservation. I'm going to scour their networks and see the kind of people that are on there who are compelling, and then I can essentially reach out to them directly or have one of my colleagues broker that relationship. So yet another reason why it's important for you to be, thinking about networking strategically, really at all times, right? I don't want this to come off as the kind of discussion where it's only important to network when you're thinking about getting a job or you're in need of a job, right? It's something that I think we all do well to sort of be thinking about year round. And then lastly, a lot of the work of recruiters reaching out is typically done in instances where we're dealing with positions that are really hard to fill, right? In some cases, we have positions that are going to receive 7, 8, 900 applications in a 2 week period, right? In those situations, I'm going to kind of be underwater just getting through the 7, 8, 900 applications, right? And a lot of those applications are going to be quality and high level, right? So there's going to be less of a need for me to actively engage in that outreach. Also just kind of from a time constraint standpoint. So yeah, I think it's just one more slide, Rhonda. Thank you again. So yeah, a word about reaching out to recruiters, right? As somebody who's in that role. As you'd imagine, to use a phrase that we've been using since the pandemic, I think now more than ever, right? Recruiters are receiving hundreds of emails from applicants, right? Which makes it really hard for us to respond and also kind of do all the other things that of course come with the job. That being said, if you do make the decision to contact a recruiter, again, my sort of advice there is to be concise and quite clear in your message, right? Which is, a sort of broken record at this point. I've used concise, clear, thoughtful probably 10 times over the last 15 minutes. Um, but I say that because it's important, and again, to sort of separate yourself out from the fray, you're really going to need to do that. So from there, asking for an interview can be and is often off-putting, right? So in lieu of doing that, I would say use your message to highlight concrete past experiences, for example, a specific role, duties and responsibilities, and the exact organization that you worked at and where you did those things, right? And then how all of that aligns with the job that you've applied for. Again, I'd really recommend that you shy away from messages that essentially do the thing that is quite common, right? Where the applicant informs the recruiter that they've applied for the job, they think they're a good fit, and they would love to find a time to discuss their experience and learn more about the role. The reason I say shy away from that is that it's essentially an interview, right? That's kind of what the interview process is. So we're obviously looking at lots of applications, resumes, cover letters, and we're getting lots of messages that are crafted in that same way, where someone says, "Hey, I think I'm a good fit. I'd love to find a time for us to talk." When in fact that's sort of what everybody is hoping for, which is why they applied. So lastly, on occasion, I will respond to a really well-crafted message. So it is possible, but again, it's sort of incumbent upon you, I think, not just to reach me, but to reach any recruiter, to really be clear on what your why is, and figure out a way to present yourself um, in such a way that you're going to stand out from the crowd, right? And we can talk a bit more about how to do that in the Q&A, because that's all I had. Thanks so much for your time.
Dave, we're going to go right into the Q&A. So we've got a good amount of time. So keep those questions coming. We're going to start off with a couple that were pre-submitted when during registration process. So, and Dave, you covered a lot of those questions in your presentation, which was great. You touched on this a little bit during your remarks, but we had a question asking about if you're working in an unrelated field and you want to transition into preservation or history, like how would you use LinkedIn as a tool to do that? Or I guess conversely, if you're currently working in the field and want to transition to something else, how would you maybe use LinkedIn to help with that transition?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's something that I confronted because initially, I mean, this isn't about me, so I'm not attempting to navel gaze. It's just an example. So when I left executive search, I thought I was done with recruiting, right? So I was attempting to transition into academic and career counseling on college campuses. So I say that to say the very first thing that I did was, I went to grad school, have a PhD, all of that, thought I was going to go into the academy, but I reached out to a former mentor of mine who was a academic and career counselor when I was wrapping up my graduate studies in Chicago, right? So I reached out to her to say, "Hey, Selena, I'd like to pivot. I'd love to sort of get a sense of what it is you do every day, what the job looks like, and then beyond that, I live in Philadelphia. The University of Pennsylvania is here. That's actually why we moved here. My partner was in grad school there. But to make a long story short, what Selena was able to do because she's working in that space was she immediately sent an email to someone who um, was like an associate dean of graduate education. So then I had a 45-minute info interview with this person, and then they connected me to a person in their graduate career counseling and advising office. And then I had a 30, 40-minute person conversation with that person. And then there was another person in that office that they connected me to. And I had a third conversation, right? So as a result of all of that, it was sort of a way for me to begin to build a network in a space that I hadn't previously worked in, right? So, I think there are a couple of ways to answer it, right? To the extent you have that network, someone who uh, is sort of working in the field of history. I'm trying to kind of remember transition into the field of history. That was sort of the HR question, right?
Yep.
So if you know someone who's working in that field, I think that's the perfect place to start, which is to say you reach out to that person and say, hey, I've been doing HR, but I'm really thinking I have this passion in history. I have a degree, master's degree in history, and would love to just, pick your brain and get a sense of like, what was your career path? How did you get to where you are? How do you think I could transfer my skills as an HR person to the extent they're relevant, while also just leveraging my history background, right? And sort of one thing I didn't mention is that you're sort of taught when you info interview, both as someone who's obviously done it on both ends, right? I've had people make themselves available to me, and I've also done it for others. The idea is that you're supposed to walk away with at least one name, right? So they're supposed to come out of that and say, we're going to introduce you. I'm going to introduce you to this other person who is also working in the history field, and they can help to advance your search, your pursuit, etc. Right? So I think, and that can be done through LinkedIn or not, right? A lot of what was happening for me was just all done through emails, right? It was sort of Selena had these relationships with all these people at Penn working in career services. So she just sent emails introducing, you know, me to them and then sort of taking herself out of it. But I also do the thing on LinkedIn. I've been in those sort of, situations where I introduce somebody to someone else, or someone introduces me. But I think that's sort of an easy way if you have an in, right? Um, if you don't, I think it's a little more challenging, right? Because you could be in the position where you're trying to reach out to someone cold. But I think if most of us dig deep, I think there's someone that's working in a field that we have a relationship with, even if it's not top of mind, right? Or even if it's not directly, because what I don't want to suggest is that you want to work in a historic house museum. So that means that the only person that's going to be relevant and useful for you to talk to is somebody doing that, right? You could talk to somebody who is a history and professor at a university, right? Or you could talk to somebody who's a historian um, at a nonprofit, right? There just any number of ways to sort of begin to have that conversation, right? And then from there, you get sort of into the broader network. So people are beginning to mention conferences and inviting you to other places where you'll have an even greater chance to expand your network, as well as all the online forums, right? Like what y'all have done so beautifully with Preservation Leadership Forum, right? Where you've created this place for people who are preservationists to kind of come in and sort of find space and get answers to questions and build a network, et cetera. I know that wasn't as specific as I would have liked it to be. So I'm happy to follow up, or for the person interested to follow up.
Thanks, Dave. I'm also thinking of sort of a related question to that that we didn't touch upon. If you're on the receiving end of a request for, say an informational interview, do you have any tips on how to be most helpful? You mentioned leaving that type of situation, making a connection with at least one other person. Any other tips for people who are trying to be helpful for those who are, seeking jobs or other networking?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the huge first step is saying yes, right? Because that goes a long way. People are struggling. The job market can be a lonely place. Trying to pivot can be a lonely place. As I mentioned before we got on the call, I applied to like maybe 50 jobs before I landed at the trust. My partner applied to one job and got it, right? But my experience is more the rule. Hers was kind of the exception. Um, so it's a lonely place, right? So for you to say to someone, yes, I'm happy to make 30 minutes of my time for you, is incredible, right? I think in terms of on the front end, how you can be helpful is to say, hey, in advance of our conversation, it'd be great if you could share your resume with me, just so you sort of have a sense of what they've been up to. You can build out some questions from there, right? Because again, it's an opportunity for them to ask questions of you and sort of learn more about how you've gotten to where you are. But it's also a space for you, I think, to help them think through what they want to do in the future, right? It's sort of a brainstorming opportunity in certain ways, right? So the more that you have and know in advance, particularly if we're talking about a 30-minute conversation, I think that's really helpful. I think another thing is to be um, an advocate and somebody that's looking, right? So, I have lots of conversations with people. In most cases, we don't necessarily have a job at the National Trust that I can direct them to, just because, we're a 200 and something person nonprofit in terms of FTEs. Um, but I am serious and try to be serious about the business of looking at other organizations, connecting them with other people, always having in the back of my mind, okay, I know this person, they're really interested in descendant engagement as it relates to um, slavery at historic sites, right? This is work that we've done and the Action Fund has done a brilliant job with, right? But there are other places that are doing it and that sort of thing. So I can have that in the back of my mind. I can talk to other colleagues. I can think creatively with other folks. I can introduce them to those other folks. So I think those are all ways to be really helpful. I think it's transparent and sort of honest as you can be, both just about the nature of the market, but also just your own experience, right? What's worked well for you, how you got from point A to point B, right? Because I think a lot of times people think that everyone's path is linear and then that they're somehow the person that doesn't have the linear path, right? Like, and they're like, well, I don't know how I'm going to make it because I did this, but it doesn't really connect with this other thing. You'd be surprised when you talk to enough people that for most folks, it wasn't a straight line, right? So I think sharing that and being vulnerable in that way, I think can also be helpful.
Yeah, very true. Another question we received ahead of time was looking at suggestions on how to present past experience that might be considered sort of a double-edged sword. The example they used was working,
FEMA,
yeah, an architectural
yeah,
historian for FEMA.
right, right. Yeah, so for me, I think that's where it behooves you to focus on the broad transferable skills, right? So in this case, if I wrote it down correctly, this person was an architectural historian at FEMA, right? So there, without knowing more, obviously it's more complicated than that, right? I think the extent to which they can articulate the ways in which they utilize, their experience as sort of an architecture expert and then also a historian is perhaps more important than the fact that FEMA was their employer, right? Which isn't to say there aren't certain aspects of the work for FEMA that could be relevant for a particular job. But I think the architecture expertise, the history piece, the fact they worked as a historian, I think that allows them to cast a much wider net, right? And I think it allows them to locate themselves um, in a wide variety of domains and fields, right? Because I think sometimes we can become narrowly focused on the employer, right? And think, well, this is so niche, like FEMA, I'm working for the federal government. How do I translate that to um, a for-profit architectural firm or a nonprofit like the National Trust, right? We don't have an architectural historian on our books right now, but it's certainly a position that I could see us hiring for, in the future, right? And I don't see why someone with that expertise wouldn't be a strong candidate simply because they worked at FEMA, right? So I think again, just figuring out what you can pull, what's broadly transferable, I think is the way to really kind of position yourself as a strong candidate, right? I joke, this is, I have a certain kind of sense of humor my colleagues are used to. But I joke that like 9 out of 10 jobs are project management. So it's like, you know, if you can manage projects in one environment, you can probably manage them in 7 or 8 other environments, right? Which isn't to say there isn't any role for certain kinds of expertise. Of course there is. But to the extent they have the expertise, which is why they were an architectural historian. I think there's an easy case for them to make when they sort of drill down and think about the broadest aspect of the skill set and the role or the skill set and the experiences that they deployed in that role, that I think would make them marketable across a variety of sectors, for profit, nonprofit. Obviously, they have the government experience. So yeah, I would feel good framing it that way.
Great. We have a question about how to respond to people who send a connection request without a message, and who they don't know, but they are in the same field.
Yeah, that's a challenging one. And I'm, just again, I try to be honest and transparent. I would say it can be a toss up, a flip of the coin. Again, my recommendation there would be to spend 30 minutes and just craft a message, right? Um, Try to avoid what the algorithm is going to pop in, because like I'm on LinkedIn, they do it for me. They put a paragraph in and it's like, no, this isn't what I want to say. But try to spend a half hour and craft a message, right? You have access to that person's LinkedIn profile typically, so you can see sort of what they do, what they're interested in, and try to find some common ground there, right? And use however many words you have. I don't remember. I have a recruiter account, so I have more words at my disposal and can craft longer messages. But whatever the word count is, I would say try to use that, um, to say something that forges a connection, right? Um, because I think people are just more likely to respond to that, as opposed to what can come off as um, a very sort of easy, um, paint by numbers kind of approach, where you're just kind of clicking and grasping at as many straws as possible, right? And I don't mean any of this disrespectfully in any way. Like, it's incredibly hard to navigate the market right now. I'm just trying to sort of give some guidance on things that I know have worked well, not only for me personally, but also how colleagues of mine, in the field, in talent, are more likely to respond, right? And people appreciate that well crafted message, right? In the same way that when you get an email or, a card in the mail and somebody has crafted, a really thoughtful message, right? Um, I'm fortunate to be a donor, for a handful of organizations, and I got a every now and then I get handwritten letters, right, from students at universities where I donate. I donate to, um, a number of dance companies, arts organizations. And when you get that handwritten letter, it just means something different, right, than receiving the sort of form letter that went out to everyone. I got a letter from someone at Kyle Abraham's dance company, and the development officer, she mentioned the fact that I was in Philadelphia and they were going to be performing in Philly on a certain day, and she hoped that I'd be there for the show. And that just meant a lot more than just the typical, hey, we appreciate your donation. Right. So, I just use that as an analogy to say, again, you can't sort of overstate the value of that human touch.
Yeah. We have a question, just about how you craft your profile. And they were asking, do you prefer job summaries, responsibilities on LinkedIn to be longer, shorter, or about the same compared to how it's written on a resume?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say there are different schools of thought. Um, I would say the summary, should be short, right? Because I think you're getting even less time, on LinkedIn, because in many cases you're not an applicant, right? Whereas the resume, if I'm getting your resume 9 times out of 10, it's because you've applied, right? So I'm giving you a bit more time than when I'm going through. And again, and there aren't 2 million applicants that I'm ever looking at our portal, right? So I would say, to the extent that you can be a bit more, um, concise, to use that word for the 70th time. I should have did a um, broke out a thesaurus clearly before before this, so I apologize. My vocabulary is bigger than 100 words, I assure you. Yeah, I think that can be important. Again, there are two opinions around should your LinkedIn profile directly mirror your resume or not, right? And I think some of that depends on what kind of story you need to tell, right? So I think if you have a resume where you've moved from one, let's just say one marketing job uh, to another, and you've spent 3 to 5 years at each job with increasing responsibility, different organizations, many of them with kind of a national name brand, whether for profit, nonprofit, et cetera, the government. I think you can sort of get away with not having the sort of bullet points that one has in a resume, right? Because I think the sort of length of experience, the job title, the organization is speaking for itself. It's doing that work for you,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and that's sort of related to another question we got here about if you only want to expand your network, you're not seeking, a new job, how should your profile be different or look different than to others?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another great point. I think it dovetails with what I was saying, right? I think there's less information required, right? Because people
Mhm.
will see, it's unfortunate, but again, I have to sort of like remain within the reality of the world that we currently exist in, right? So I joke, in some cases, this is an executive search joke, but we would do these really complicated reports where it was like, we've talked to 300 people and so and so recommended this person and that person. And they're like 15-page printouts. A buddy of mine, we joke that if you have the right names, and that means like so and so's at Harvard, this person's at Princeton. You could essentially write that on a napkin, right? So I say that to say part of what's going on is that people are making um, various kinds of judgments about the kinds of organizations that people have worked at, right? The
Mhm.
National Trust for Historic Preservation, leading preservation organization in the United States, right? You put that on there, you're a preservationist. That means something to people all over the country in the field of preservation, right? If you say you've been there 7 years, whatever your title is, that's sort of sufficient, particularly to your point if you're not looking for a job, right?
Mhm.
If you're looking for a job, I think there's room and conversation to have more in the way of bullet points, and maybe you want to have some recommendations and endorsements and all these other things, right? But I look at a lot of people that um, are in C-suite level positions, VP positions across industries, and in their LinkedIn page, it's essentially the last 5 jobs they've had, the title, and the organization, and that's it. Uh,
Mhm.
so I think that's more than sufficient to your point if you're just looking to kind of build that network, right? So I think with that, you crafting a smart, you know, 200-word message to someone who you want to connect with about why you want to connect with them. If you have a mutual contact in common, you can certainly reference that person, or again, best case scenario, ask that they broker that relationship. But I think you're in pretty good shape, if you sort of have that work history. Right? It's more challenging for people that are early in their career and don't have as much of a work history versus people that, have been working for, 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. Well, We might end on this question because I feel like we'll probably have a lot to say about it. But someone is asking about advice for older candidate, and do you see a lot of ageism? Which, I don't think we can answer in 4 minutes, but we'll
Right, 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 right. No, it's a great question. Obviously, I have to start by saying that the National Trust does not discriminate in any way based on age or any number of other protected categories. Um, you know, but I think it's also important to recognize that people do have biases, right? And I think part of what is important for people that have been, I'm not even going to focus on the age as much, it's just in the job market for longer periods of time, is to figure out how to present their experience in a way that is relevant and useful for a potential employer, right? So what that means in a lot of cases is um, shortening the resume, right? So, to give you an example, there are people that submit 7, 8 page resumes, which aren't generally that helpful, right? And again, if you think about a reality where sometimes there's 600 or 700 resumes in a portal for one job, the extent to which you can get that resume down to a page or two, I think it's really important, not only because it's saving the recruiter time, but I think also because it's suggesting that you have figured out a way to distill all the different things that you've done um, in such a way that it makes clear to the recruiter, the potential employer, that you understand what it is they're looking for, because they're generally looking for a specific thing, right? And you're able to locate what that thing is or those particular skills from a broad work history and to package it in a way that is palatable, right? Which isn't to say you can't draw from something that you did 20 years ago, but I think it's also just a challenge to figure out a way to kind of make the body of your work history digestible.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Dave. We're gonna have to wrap things up. Yeah, but I do want to end with a couple quick announcements of some upcoming events. So we have two conferences coming up in the fall, Pass Forward in Milwaukee and the National Preservation Law Conference in DC. Both of these conferences have online opportunities. So if you're not able to travel to those locations, please look at the online options. If you liked what we were doing for our summer webinar series, we'll have more of that in Milwaukee, and you'll have some opportunities to speak to National Trust staff individually, including Dave. So please come to Milwaukee and see us. Our early bird registration is ending in about 2 weeks. So if you're thinking of coming, save some money and register now. And then finally, just thanks to everyone who attended the webinar today. Sorry if we didn't get to all of your questions. Please reach out if you'd like to contact us. Our contact information is right here. And we look forward to more webinars in the fall. So thanks, Dave, and thanks all of
Yeah,
you
no,
for
thank,
attending.
thank you all. And I'm on LinkedIn, so reach out to me if you have any questions. Happy to chat.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rhonda.
Yep.
Thanks, Colleen.